My landlady warned me. If I stayed, everything between us would change, but I didn't realize how much. The day I moved into the apartment, I didn't know that a simple handshake could linger in memory for weeks. I was carrying boxes that were just slightly too heavy, my backpack slipping from one shoulder to the other, when she opened the door. My landlady, a woman in her early 40s, stood there with a calm, almost effortless presence that immediately made me aware of her. She was dressed casually, in a soft blouse and jeans, the kind of comfortable style that somehow still looked graceful and intentional. The sunlight through the doorway caught her hair, turning it a warm shade of chestnut, and for a moment, I forgot to breathe. "Hi," she said, her voice warm but measured, like she was weighing the world and deciding to let me in just a little. I handed her my forms and keys, fumbling slightly with the pen, and she smiled. A subtle, knowing smile that felt both welcoming and enigmatic. She guided me through the apartment, pointing out the little quirks. A slightly squeaky floorboard in the living room, the way the light hits the kitchen counter in the afternoon, the small crack in the bathroom tile that she promised to fix someday. Every detail she mentioned seemed casual, but I noticed how her eyes lingered on me whenever she spoke, just for a fraction longer than necessary. As I set down the last of my boxes, I couldn't help but notice the faint scent of her perfume lingering in the air. Something floral and warm, comforting in a way I hadn't expected to feel from someone I'd just met. She moved around the apartment with ease, brushing a hand across a shelf, pausing to adjust a small picture frame, and each gesture felt deliberate, yet natural. There was a quiet confidence in her movements, but also an underlying softness, a hint of vulnerability she didn't try to hide. When she handed me the keys, our fingers brushed for a split second. It was fleeting, barely noticeable, but my chest tightened, and I felt a curious warmth spread through me. I noticed how her gaze followed me to each corner of the room, and I realized she was observing me as much as I was observing her. There was something unspoken in the way she looked at me, a quiet curiosity, perhaps even a subtle warning. I didn't know it yet, but this was the first of many moments where simple gestures would carry the weight of things left unsaid. Before leaving, she paused by the doorway, resting her hand lightly on the frame. "I hope you'll be happy here," she said, her tone casual but layered with meaning. There was a hesitation in her eyes, a hint that she was aware that the space we shared, the apartment, the sunlight, the quiet moments, could change things between us. I nodded, too aware of the warmth in her presence to respond with anything more than a simple thank you. As I closed the door behind her, I realized that moving in wasn't just about a new apartment. It was the beginning of something that I couldn't yet name. A slow, quiet pull toward someone who was older, wiser, and quietly captivating. And somewhere deep down, I knew that things were about to change, even if neither of us knew exactly how living in the apartment had started to feel less like a temporary stay and more like stepping into a small, private world, one that was subtly shaped by her presence. At first, our interactions had been polite and brief, measured by the unspoken rules between a tenant and a landlady. But over the past few days, I noticed how the rhythm of the apartment seemed to adjust to her, how her laughter, soft and unhurried, filled the corners of the rooms and lingered longer than the sound of the city outside. Mornings became our quiet ritual. She would make coffee, the rich aroma drifting through the small kitchen, and I'd hover nearby, pretending to scroll through my phone while actually watching how she moved. There was something mesmerizing in the casual way she poured her drink, the faint brush of her hand against my shoulder as she passed me the sugar. The gesture was small, almost accidental, but it carried a warmth that made my chest tighten in a way I wasn't used to feeling. Sometimes, she'd pause mid-gesture and look at me. Just look, with a subtle tilt of her head, her eyes hinting at amusement or curiosity. I never knew what she was thinking, but I felt seen in a way that was rare and a little disarming. I found myself noticing other details too. The quiet way she tucked a loose strand of hair behind her ear, the soft hum she sometimes made while tidying up, the way the sunlight made her eyes glimmer with an almost secretive brightness. Even mundane chores became moments of connection. When I fixed a leaky faucet or carried groceries inside, she'd appear nearby, offering guidance with a casual touch on my arm or shoulder. These small, fleeting touches were loaded with meaning, a gentle reassurance, a subtle acknowledgement of presence. And each time, I felt the curious tension of proximity, the kind that makes ordinary moments feel charged. Our conversations, too, were layered with unspoken understanding. She would ask about my day in a tone that was both casual and genuinely attentive, leaning slightly toward me as though to catch every word. I caught myself speaking more openly than I intended, sharing small, personal thoughts, drawn out by the ease of her presence. And when I paused, she would offer a small smile or a nod, silently encouraging me without needing to say much. Evenings brought another kind of intimacy. I'd find her sitting by the window, sipping tea, the glow of the streetlights soft on her face. Sometimes, she'd glance at me, and we'd sit in quiet companionship, our shoulders nearly touching, our shared silence speaking volumes. There was an awareness growing between us, a mutual recognition that these small, ordinary moments were shaping something more, something neither of us fully understood yet. By the end of the week, I realized that my fascination was no longer just admiration or curiosity. It was a growing, almost tangible awareness of her, of how her presence filled the apartment and my mind, of how a simple gesture or glance could make my day feel unexpectedly full. And I could sense, beneath her composed exterior, a similar awareness, a recognition that the routines we shared might be quietly bending towards something neither of us could ignore. By the time a couple of weeks had passed, the apartment no longer felt like just a place to stay. It had become a space shaped by her presence, warm, lived in, and quietly magnetic. Our interactions had evolved from polite exchanges to something more layered. There was a rhythm forming between us, one built on subtle teasing, shared routines, and moments that hovered just at the edge of intimacy. She had a way of teasing that was impossible to ignore. One evening, as I fumbled with the apartment's old washing machine, she leaned against the doorway, arms crossed, a smile playing on her lips. "You really have no idea what you're doing, do you?" she said, her tone light, but her eyes bright with amusement. I laughed, feeling the heat rise in my chest. "I'm trying," I replied, though I knew she could see through my clumsy honesty. She stepped closer under the pretense of inspecting the machine, and her hand brushed mine as she pointed out a knob I'd overlooked. It was a fleeting touch, but it sent an unexpected jolt through me, a reminder of the quiet tension simmering between us. These little moments were becoming a language of their own. A brush of her hair from her face, a hand resting briefly on my shoulder when she passed by, a pause in conversation where our eyes met just a moment too long. Each gesture carried an unspoken weight. She seemed fully aware of the effect she had on me, and I found myself both captivated and cautious, trying to read her signals without overstepping boundaries. There were also glimpses of vulnerability beneath her confident exterior. Sometimes, I would catch her staring out the window, lost in thought, a faint sigh escaping her lips. In those moments, she seemed almost fragile, and I felt an urge to bridge the gap between us, to offer comfort with nothing more than a hand on her arm or a shared glance. And yet, the playful energy that defined our interactions kept me guessing, reminding me that any step forward needed care and subtlety. Even our conversations began to shift. Casual remarks about the apartment or my daily life would take on layers of meaning, carrying hints of something more than friendship. She would laugh at my awkward jokes, teasing me gently, then pause as if considering whether she had said too much. I responded with the same mixture of sincerity and hesitation, aware of the growing pull between us. In the quiet evenings, when the city outside was muted and the apartment bathed in warm lamplight, these playful pushes became almost magnetic. We'd find ourselves lingering near each other, standing close in the kitchen, sitting just a little too near on the couch, each of us testing boundaries, feeling the subtle charge in the space between. Every accidental touch, every shared smile, every lingering glance seemed amplified in that intimate atmosphere. By the end of this week, it was clear. The small, everyday moments were no longer just about convenience or routine. They were about connection, about noticing each other in ways that went beyond the surface. And deep down, I sensed that she, too, was aware of the tension building between us, the quiet attraction that neither of us had dared to name, but which had begun to shape every glance, every gesture, every shared laugh. It was one of those evenings when the city outside had quieted down, leaving the apartment wrapped in a warm, amber glow from the overhead lamp. We had been talking about nothing in particular, the kind of mundane conversation that somehow felt intimate because of her presence. She was sitting on the edge of the couch, a cup of tea warming her hands, while I perched on the floor against the sofa, trying to keep my own nerves at bay. The silence between us had grown thick with unspoken thoughts, and I could feel her awareness of my gaze, just as I felt hers on me. Finally, she spoke, her voice softer than usual. "I don't know if you realize, staying here, it might change things between us." There was a hesitancy in her tone, a crack in her usual composed exterior. Her fingers traced absent patterns along the edge of her cup, betraying the vulnerability beneath her calm. I swallowed hard, my heart picking up speed. That single sentence carried the weight of everything we hadn't said. Every lingering glance, every accidental touch, every moment of closeness that had built over the past few weeks. I know, I admitted, my voice quiet, almost matching hers. "I felt it too." I hesitated, unsure if I should elaborate or just let the truth hang between us. But the tension in the room demanded honesty. "I don't want to overstep. I don't want to make things complicated. But I can't pretend I don't notice or feel." My words faltered, but she nodded slightly, encouraging me to continue, to strip away the careful walls we had both built. The way she looked at me then, eyes soft, vulnerable, yet still strong, made my chest ache. There was no teasing, no playful deflection. Just her, unguarded, letting me see a part of herself that she rarely revealed. She shifted slightly closer, the warmth of her shoulder brushing mine, a gesture that carried more meaning than any words could. I felt the subtle tremor of closeness, the kind of tension that made time stretch and ordinary moments feel monumental. We talked for hours, really talked about fears, boundaries, and desires we hadn't dared to name. I learned that her caution wasn't about disinterest. It was about protecting herself from the uncertainty of what our connection might mean. And I realized that my own hesitation stemmed from the same place, from the awareness of age, expectations, and the fragile balance between friendship and something deeper. By the end of the evening, we weren't exactly closer in a traditional sense. No grand declarations, no dramatic gestures. But we had crossed a threshold. There was a quiet acknowledgement, an unspoken understanding that our relationship was changing. That night, the air between us felt charged, electric, yet tender. Every glance, every brush of our hands as I helped clear the table, seemed amplified, loaded with intention and meaning. When I finally stood to leave, she gave me a small, tentative smile, the kind that held both warning and invitation. "We'll figure this out," she said softly, and in her eyes, I saw the same mixture of hope and fear that mirrored my own. As I walked to my bedroom, I realized that hesitation could be a kind of intimacy too, a shared vulnerability that made every future interaction feel alive with possibility. The apartment had begun to feel like a world entirely our own, a space where the air itself seemed to hum with anticipation. Days had passed since our confession of hesitation, yet nothing explicit had changed between us. And somehow, that unspoken tension made every interaction feel more intense, more charged. It was in the way she moved past me in the kitchen, her arm brushing mine just slightly, sending a shiver I pretended not to notice. It was in the soft tilt of her head when she laughed, eyes lingering on me for just a heartbeat too long. Small, accidental touches became moments that spoke louder than words. One evening, as she handed me a mug of steaming tea, our fingers met briefly on the handle. The contact was fleeting, but the warmth lingered in my hand long after she had pulled away. I caught myself staring at her, trying to read her expression. A playful smirk, a softening of her gaze, and realizing that each touch, each glance, was becoming a language we both understood. Our conversations had deepened too, but even in dialogue, the silence between words carried meaning. We would talk about mundane things, errands, recipes, the weather, but occasionally, her eyes would meet mine, steady and intimate, as if daring me to acknowledge the growing desire simmering beneath the surface. I noticed the subtle shift in her posture when she was near me. A lean toward my side, a shoulder angled in my direction, fingers brushing lightly against my arm. Every movement was a quiet invitation, a test of boundaries we were both eager to explore. There was a beauty in the restraint, in the way we both acknowledged the attraction without forcing it. One rainy afternoon, we ended up sitting on the couch together, sharing a blanket while the storm rattled the windows. Our knees touched accidentally, then lingered, and I could feel the warmth of her leg against mine. I wanted to ask if it was okay to move closer, but words weren't necessary. Her eyes said yes, though cautiously, and that alone was enough. The sound of rain outside, the dim light, the quiet rhythm of our breathing. It all created a bubble where the rest of the world faded away. Even her laughter had become intoxicating, carrying a subtle undertone that made my chest tighten. When she leaned in to point out something in a book I was holding, I felt her hair brush against my face, her proximity sending a rush of heat through me. I realized that desire wasn't always loud or urgent. Sometimes it was in the brush of fingertips, the lingering glance, the gentle press of a shoulder, the subtle ways two people could communicate longing without speaking it aloud. By the end of the week, it was clear that the unspoken desire between us had become a presence in itself, shaping our days and evenings in quiet but undeniable ways. Each moment we spent together, a shared cup of tea, a lingering hug, a soft touch on the hand, carried meaning, a tension that neither of us could ignore. And though no words had crossed the line into confession, the bond had deepened, charged with a quiet, electric anticipation that made every glance, every touch, every pause feel alive. That night, the apartment felt different, heavier, yet charged with an energy I hadn't noticed before. The city outside had quieted into a low hum, leaving only the soft glow of the lamplight to illuminate her face. We were sitting on the couch together, shoulders brushing, sharing a blanket that smelled faintly of her perfume. The silence between us had been stretching for minutes, yet it wasn't uncomfortable. It was expectant, as though the space itself was waiting for something to be said, something long held back. She finally broke the silence, her voice barely above a whisper. I don't want to hide it anymore," she admitted, her fingers curling around the edge of the blanket. I looked at her, startled by the honesty, by the crack in her usually composed demeanor. There was a vulnerability there that made my chest tighten, the kind of vulnerability that invites you in, that dares you to meet it with your own truth. "I feel the same," I said, my voice low, hesitant, yet unwavering. My hand brushed against hers, and I didn't pull away. The contact was minimal, but it carried everything we hadn't said. The tension, the longing, the quiet acknowledgement of our feelings. Her eyes softened, glimmering in the warm lamplight, and for the first time, I felt that we were no longer dancing around the inevitable. We were finally acknowledging it together. We began to talk, not just about what we were feeling, but about the fears that came with it. She admitted her concern about the age difference, about the social expectations, and about the uncertainty of what this could mean for both of us. I shared my own hesitation, my awareness of the boundaries we needed to respect, and my fear of overstepping. And yet, amidst these confessions, there was a quiet relief, the kind that comes from finally being honest after weeks of careful restraint. The tension that had been building between us began to transform. It wasn't just desire anymore. It was connection, deep and unmistakable. Every glance, every small touch, her hand lingering near mine on the blanket, my shoulder brushing hers when we shifted, spoke volumes. The apartment, once just a living space, had become a witness to our slow, careful unraveling of restraint, a place where unspoken feelings finally found words. At one point, our faces were close, mere inches apart, and the unspoken question hung in the air. "Is this real?" She gave me a small, almost shy smile, and I responded in kind, leaning just slightly closer, our shoulders pressing together in a quiet, intimate affirmation. There was no rush, no need to force the moment, just the recognition of what had been growing quietly between us. By the end of the night, we weren't shouting our love from rooftops. Instead, we shared something subtler, more profound. Emotional honesty, mutual acknowledgement of desire, and the understanding that whatever came next, we had crossed a threshold together. The apartment was silent, save for the faint hum of the city, and in that quiet, I realized that this was the point where restraint became trust, tension became intimacy, and unspoken feelings became a promise of what could be. The days that followed our confession carried a new rhythm. The apartment felt warmer, not because of sunlight or heaters, but because of the quiet understanding that had settled between us. Every glance, every brush of hands, every shared cup of coffee now carried the weight of something deeper, a mutual acknowledgement that we had stepped beyond hesitation and into connection. It was subtle, tender, and profoundly human. Mornings became gentle rituals. I would wake to the faint aroma of her coffee brewing in the kitchen, the sound of the spoon against the mug, soft and deliberate. She'd catch me lingering in the doorway, her eyes crinkling with amusement, and our hands would brush as she handed me the cup. Those small touches, once fleeting and accidental, now felt deliberate yet natural. A quiet way of saying, I'm here. We're here. Evenings were filled with similar intimacy. We'd find ourselves side by side on the couch, reading or scrolling through our phones, the blanket draped loosely over our shoulders. Occasionally, her leg would press against mine, or her hand would graze mine as she adjusted the blanket. The world outside, the city lights, the distant sirens, faded away, leaving only the warmth of our shared space. There was no need for words. The closeness itself spoke volumes. Conversation flowed more easily now, layered with humor, warmth, and quiet teasing. She would share anecdotes from her day, and I would listen, leaning slightly toward her, noticing the way her eyes glimmered when she laughed. I found myself reciprocating with honesty, sharing thoughts and feelings I had kept to myself, encouraged by her attentive presence. Each exchange, no matter how mundane, strengthened the bond we had carefully built over weeks of tension, hesitation, and unspoken longing. Even physical affection remained tender and respectful. A hand on her shoulder while passing by, a lingering brush of fingertips when reaching for the same object, a light hug at the end of the day. Each gesture was a reaffirmation of our connection. There was a delicacy to it, a balance between desire and restraint, intimacy and respect. The slow burn that had drawn us together now found expression in these simple, meaningful moments. One quiet morning, as sunlight spilled across the kitchen table, she looked at me with a soft smile. "I'm glad you stayed," she said, and there was a sincerity in her voice that made my heart swell. I reached across the table, my fingers brushing hers, and she didn't pull away. The gesture was small, but it held everything: trust, affection, and the unspoken promise of the future. It was a quiet affirmation that, yes, we were together, fully, gently, and consciously choosing each other. By the time I leaned back, watching her sip her coffee, I realized that the apartment, once just a place to live, had become a vessel for something far more enduring. It had witnessed the tentative beginnings, the playful boundaries, the confessions, and the slow, careful unfolding of our hearts. And now, in this shared space filled with warmth, laughter, and gentle touches, we had found a rhythm that was ours alone, a subtle but unbreakable bond. The story didn't end with dramatic declarations or grand gestures. Instead, it ended with the quiet certainty of connection, the comfort of trust, and the intimacy of knowing that we were, finally, together, ready to explore the future at our own deliberate, slow-burn pace. If you felt the slow-burn tension and quiet intimacy of their story, don't forget to hit like and subscribe for more heartfelt romances. Share your thoughts in the comments. Do you believe love can grow quietly, over time, like theirs? And hit the bell icon so you never miss a new story that tugs at your heart.